It was a Saturday in late October, and I had been dressing up the front yard with my 9-year-old son Danny for Halloween. It was nothing fancy, just the usual collection of gravestones, a hanging witch, and a few pumpkins which we had carved the night before. We hadn't long been at that house, having only moved in the previous July. My wife Kelly worked during the day on Saturday, so we thought that this would be a nice surprise for her to come home to. Throughout the day, we received a few compliments from passersby, who I didn't know if they lived on the street or not, and Kelly adored our efforts when she finally arrived home. We had Chinese takeout that evening, and Danny asked if he could see the decorations again before he went to bed, so I opened the door and went out with him. As we got outside though, something wasn't right. There was a man standing almost on our property. He looked to be in his 60s or 70s, with thin white hair down to his shoulders and a strange, almost skeletal look to him. He was dressed like he was about to go to church, and had an odd smile on his face, like it was forced or something. I asked if he liked the decorations, and after a few seconds he replied that the previous owner, whose name was Kitty Emerson, had died in our house. This really put my back up, and if it was true, then it was the first I had heard of it. Either way, it wasn't right to say that in front of Danny, but the guy was old, and old people have a tendency to speak directly sometimes, so I thought I'd cut him some slack. I asked if he lived on the street, and he pointed to one of the houses out to the left, all without taking his eyes off the yard. I was about to wish him a good evening and go inside, when he said that Kitty Emerson wouldn't have trashed the yard with the Lord's vomit, like we did. To my surprise, Danny, who was usually shy around people he didn't know, said that Halloween was only once a year and that we enjoyed the holiday. This comment took away the man's smile, and he frowned at Danny like he was a sworn enemy. He shouted at Danny to never talk back to him again and actually raised his hand at my son. That was enough. I told Danny to go inside, and I warned the old man never to threaten him again. Weirdly, he seemed to ignore what I'd said, and that odd smile returned again. I stayed on the yard until he wandered off, which was a few minutes later. After telling Kelly all about what had happened, I actually fell asleep very quickly, probably from all the physical exertion during the day, but I still woke up in the middle of the night, and Kelly wasn't there. I checked the ensuite, and she wasn't in there either, so I walked towards Danny's room and I could hear muffled crying. I felt a moment of relief when I saw Kelly in there, comforting him. I asked what had happened, and she said that Danny saw somebody looking through his window. We lived in a single-story house, so I knew that was a possibility, but Danny regularly suffered from nightmares as well, and this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. I was going to search the property though, so I went back into our bedroom to get my phone to use the torch on it, when I stopped dead in my tracks. There was a face at the window in the hallway. I only saw it for a brief second before it disappeared. I clutched the door handle and tried to get my heartbeat under control, then I got my phone, called the police, and waited with Kelly and Danny until they turned up. After a thorough check, they said that there was no sign of an attempt to break in, but the decorations in the front yard had all been destroyed, and my car tires had been slashed. It was only then when it clicked. I told the officer about the altercation earlier that evening, and they took some notes and then headed over to see the old man. We peeked through the curtains and watched him answer the door, then the police went inside the house. I didn't hear much else on the matter. We were asked again if we had any security cameras in operation, but we didn't, and they said that the old man was clean. We actually moved away in the following winter, but before we got out, I saw him one last time. He was standing on his driveway, slicing up an apple with a steak knife, and he had that weird smile on his face. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It's the kind of place where families settle down, and the most excitement you get is a garage sale or a kid riding his bike too fast down the street. It's safe and predictable. At least, it was. A few months ago, new neighbors moved into the house next door. Right from the start, something felt off about them. They were younger and always hanging around outside, smoking and blasting music at all hours. The strong smell of weed drifted through the fences and seeped into my home. I tried to ignore it at first, live and let live, but as the weeks passed, it became impossible. The music wasn't just loud, it was suffocating, always vibrating through the walls deep into the night. My kids couldn't sleep and my wife was on edge. I told myself I'd give it time, that they'd settle down, but they didn't. One night, the music was unbearable. It shook the windows, a relentless thumping that seemed to grow louder every time I tried to ignore it. My frustration boiled over and I stepped outside, crossed the lawn, and knocked on their door. For a few seconds, nothing happened, then the music cut off abruptly. The sudden silence was almost worse. The door creaked open just a sliver. I couldn't see much, just a darkened hallway and the glint of bloodshot eyes watching me. The air was thick with smoke, the stench of sweat, and something else I couldn't place. I asked them to turn the noise down in a firm but relatively friendly tone, and went back inside, feeling their eyes on my back the whole way. That night, the music never came back on, but I couldn't sleep. My house felt wrong, like something unseen had slithered in with me when I came back inside. Every shadow felt heavier, like it was hiding something. The next morning, things were different though. The usual signs of life from their house were gone. There was no music and no voices. The windows, usually open, were now tightly shut, with the blinds drawn. Something about the silence felt unnatural. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a mistake by knocking on that door. Later that day, I happened to see a patrol car parked down the street. It felt like an opportunity, a way to ease my mind. I approached the officer, keeping my tone casual. I mentioned the noise complaints and the strange way they'd acted when I confronted them. The officer listened, then asked for their address. He said he'd check it out. I watched from my window as he and another officer knocked on their door. After a long pause, the door opened. I don't know what was said, as the conversation was short, but the officers stepped inside. Minutes passed, which turned into an hour, then more police cars arrived, their lights flashing silently. Something was being carried out of the house, but I couldn't see what. An officer I had never spoken to before knocked at my door. His expression was unreadable. He asked if I could come down to the station to talk. The pit in my stomach told me I didn't want to know why. At the station, they showed me something. There was a list, and my name was written on it. There were notes scrawled beside it, details about my house and my routines. Scribbled next to that was a drawing of a gun. My mouth went dry and the officers explained in measured tones. The people in that house weren't just troublemakers, they were wanted criminals, involved in things far worse than I had imagined. The house wasn't even theirs. They'd taken it, squatting, using it as a front for something bigger, and I had made myself a problem for them. I don't remember driving home. I barely remember anything after that, just the feeling of my heart pounding against my ribs, my throat tightening. That night, my house felt smaller, every window a potential weak spot, every door too thin to be a real barrier. By the next morning, the house next door was empty. No police tape, no sign anything had happened at all, just silence. I don't know if they were arrested, or if they just disappeared, but I still feel it sometimes, like something is watching, just out of sight. And at night, when the wind howls through the trees, I swear I can still hear their music. I moved into my new place about a month ago. After a painful divorce, I just wanted to downsize, live simply, and to be honest, just be left alone. The neighborhood seemed nice enough, it was middle class, quiet, and safe. The first person to welcome me was Shannon. She was in her late 50s, I'd say, friendly, but a little too flirtatious for my taste. She showed up on my doorstep the day I moved in, smiling warmly, bringing over some cookies. We made small talk, and while she was pleasant enough, something about her felt off. I didn't think much of it at the time. I just thanked her, told her I was busy unpacking, and said goodbye. The next day, however, she was back. She was dressed like somebody half her age, and asked if I needed help with anything. I politely declined and said that I was nearly finished, and again I thanked her and said goodbye. But the day after that, she came by again. I started making excuses to cut the conversation short, hoping she'd get the hint. When that didn't work, I lied. I told her that my girlfriend was coming over. It was all I could think of to get rid of her. Shannon's expression changed instantly. The warm, friendly smile vanished. Her eyes darkened, and she let out a short, bitter laugh as she looked me up and down. She turned away without another word and walked off. For the next few days, I started noticing things. When I stepped outside to take the trash out, or even just check the mail, I would see her watching from her window. Sometimes, when I sat in my living room at night, I swore I could feel someone staring through the blinds. Paranoia set in fast. From that time, things just got worse. A stone cracked my kitchen window when my parents were over for lunch one day. I could only imagine it was Shannon. She kept writing nasty and hateful comments on my Facebook account, then quickly deleting them, and any time I went outside, Shannon would also be there. One morning, I decided to confront her. I walked up to her porch and knocked. When she opened the door, she smiled, as if she hadn't been acting strange at all. I tried to explain that I felt uncomfortable with her behavior, but she burst into laughter, loud and mocking. She shook her head and smirked, then told me that I shouldn't flatter myself, before closing the door in my face. That night, I struggled to sleep. I kept replaying the encounter in my head, telling myself that I was overreacting. She was just a lonely, eccentric neighbor, that's all. But I was about to find out the full extent of Shannon's wrath. Just before 2 a.m., I heard a creak from inside my closet, which was opposite the bed. My heart pounded, and I shot up, reached for the lamp, but before I could turn it on, the door creaked open fully. In the darkness, a shadowy figure stepped out toward me. Without thinking, I lunged. I tackled the figure to the ground, feeling their body move violently beneath me. Nails clawed at my arms and face as the person screamed obscenities and their feet kicked wildly, trying to break free. I held on, adrenaline surging through me as I fumbled for my phone. When I finally turned on the light, my stomach dropped. It was Shannon. I kept my knee pressed hard into her back as I called the cops. She didn't say a word, just trembled beneath me, breathing hard with makeup smeared all over her face. When the police arrived, they arrested her and went over the house. They found that my kitchen drawer was open, the one where I kept my knives. There were no signs of forced entry, so they reviewed the opposite neighbor's Ring doorbell footage, which showed everything. Shannon had entered my house using a key, which she must have stolen as I had a few of them cut, and she got in hours before I'd arrived home. She had been hiding somewhere, possibly in the attic, the closet, or even under the bed, just waiting. She was charged and went away for a lengthy sentence, but I couldn't settle in that house again, and the image of her creeping out of my closet will haunt me forever.